Ka tira, kua ki te rā hau, kua tai mai tō tātou rangatira, tō tātou hoia morehu, a koro bomb gillies, tēnā koe e koro, nau mai rā, he mihi nui tēnei ki a koe. Kia ora. Ka pai, and welcome to our panel discussion of the day, Te Whānau. We're going to dig a little deeper into the issue of affordability. And we've obviously heard the technical term from our leading economist, Shumabeel, that the current situation is SHIT. Luckily for us, we have these clever minds sitting here on the panel with us to further discuss some of the solutions to the current affordability challenges that lay ahead. I do want to just recap quickly with you, Shumabeel. How would you describe the current affordability at the moment in Aotearoa when it comes to housing?
It's a crisis. It's an absolute crisis, but it doesn't need to be.
There's certainly been a lot of kōrero today about hope, and Jamie, I want you to talk to us about the response that whānau have had towards some of the savings schemes with ka uruora.
We've had a really good response, but I think one of the challenges is when you haven't had intergenerational saving. I know when I was young we had the little postbank book, and I'd go to the Uranui post office and put my $1 in a week. But I think one of the challenges we have is that we don't have a culture of intergenerational saving today. Now, part of that is this sort of issue of people being able to live and survive, because household incomes relative to the cost of living are still low. And when you think about broad statistics about the number of Māori that earn over $70,000 a year, it's 11%.
Shumabeel, will housing ever be affordable again?
Of course, if we choose to act. We don't have to have poverty, we don't have to have housing crisis. It is entirely within our control. We're an extraordinarily rich country, but also we've got great examples of things that have worked. Dominic Foote from Housing Foundation took me out to see Waimahia years ago. Why don't we have 100 Waimahias around the country?
And James, we obviously heard from Jamie about intergenerational habits around savings and that sort of thing. Are there some intergenerational models to help support whānau when it comes to the issue of affordability?
Well, I think my comment, I think Jamie made the comment around, was it 40k household income and 35% of Māori whānau in rental accommodation or not in home ownership. And a lot of those people are our tenants, they're in social housing. I think the key was in what Shumabeel was saying, which is rather than being whakamā about that space, and so I'll talk from that perspective again, we see examples around the world where public housing is enabled so that people can, and resource so that people can live in dignity. And once they can do that, you've then got some choices. You can have conversations about intergenerational wealth. It's not just some perverse theory that actually makes you feel worse about yourself. So I know I'm coming back to the record here, but everyone here is going to have tens of thousands we're going to have of new social homes. And I think it's important that as Māori, we're actually in there with our values driving it so that we can have these conversations. And I'm not saying they'll all be Māori whānau. The reality is we're seeing other whānau who are benefiting as well, but we can bring our particular perspective to it. So I think the Māori models are the way to go.
Just wanting to carry on with Māori models, and Ray Morrison, I'd like you to introduce yourself to our audience as well at the top of your kōrero, because we've heard from these three gentlemen here. Tell us a bit about yourself and the mahi that you're involved with.
Kia ora everybody, my name's Ray Morrison. I'm the GM for Ngāti Whakaue Tribal Lands, and some of you may have came out and saw what we've been up to in the last 5 years at the east side at Wharenui Rise. So basically we're a large landowner in this town, and we've been fortunate to invest in some land in the 70s, which was for development, and the time has been right to start a market housing subdivision. with the underlying aim to then look at our wider parcels of land, which is whenua Māori, to create affordable housing solutions for our whānau. So we use, a commercial model to create the cash flow that we needed to fund on our whenua Māori. In saying that, we've partnered with government to make it all happen in time. So that's essentially what our model is.
You say that you've had to create the cash flow to fund on your whenua Māori. Tell us about that experience, because Shumabeel mentioned his disappointment at the Reserve Bank for having not advanced that kaupapa despite it, having been hanging around for quite some time now.
Look, it was tough, and as I said yesterday, I asked 4 banks and 4 said no, and then 1 said yes, so that's the one we went with. And it's at the end of the day, for a bank to back you, you've got to have a good plan, and market time. There's a lot of factors, so you've really got to do your homework and have everything lined up. And we're fortunate that we could do that, and as fate would have it, we timed it pretty well in the market as well. So we pitched our financial models, because it's a 2-year process to actually build the land and then have houses being built. So we had to try and pitch our financial model at a point where it was within our risk threshold, and then the market lifted, and so that gave us some headroom, and so we used the profits in that first stage to do the next, and then now we're on to doing long-term affordable rental housing on our whenua Māori.
And so, as well as having a good, solid plan, what other advice would you give providers sitting here wondering how they can do the same thing?
I just think I don't have the magic answer to it, but for us it's about getting a model that works for you and that suits you. I mean, everybody's whenua is different. It all depends on the cost of developing land, as everyone probably knows, and is pretty horrific, or can be. And if you get it wrong, it can cost as well. So it's about having a good plan. And then going with a financial model that works. And as I said, for our whenua Māori stuff, we're just fortunate that the partnership that we've got with HUD has enabled us to launch that program.
Shumabeel, what would you like to see the Reserve Bank do in this area?
Well, we need to have a standardised method where banks can lend money to Māori land. It's not that difficult.
And what would that method look like, do you think? Because they've obviously found it very difficult to grapple with.
Well, I don't think they have grappled with it. They've got a building full of people and they can't figure it out. What do we pay them for?
I want you to tell us what's your advice?
Well, I really like the model they have done in Queenstown. So what they have done with the Community Housing Trust there, I think is really good, where they've created a lease and they're borrowing the money against the lease. So there are really simple methods that we can use to use the land, create a lease on top, and put the lending on top of that. We don't need to make it too complicated, but we just need leadership, and we need to care. We need to care, because I don't think enough people care to deal with the stuff that needs dealing with. And it's not just around the lending to Māori land. Where is the leadership when it comes to lending for poor people? Why is the Reserve Bank comfortable in saying that we have a healthy financial system when our poor families have to go to loan sharks and to Afterpay and BNPL? Why is it that we have a financial system that's very cheap for the rich and the middle class, but is expensive and terrible for the poor?
James, how do we get more whānau, bringing it back to whānau, how do we get them into their own homes?
Well, I think, so two observations. One is that whānau are in a current situation, wherever they are on this so-called spectrum. We have to be leading in terms of improving where they are now. Their levels of knowledge, the levels of support, the quality of the life. Things as basic as the quality of the physical environment for a start off. To get that sort of eyes open, hearts open, getting the hopeometer moving in the right direction. I think the other thing, just to jump completely out of that space, is so we work with some, like Ray over here, we work with some really good people, Kararaina and some of her team at HUD, and other people within the system. But the system itself has an embedded lack of trust for Māori initiatives, bluntly. And so if you want to deal with this thing, in actual fact, you've got to deal to that. You've got to find a way to actually build a higher trust model. The amount of time and resource and money we spend, and we've got 40 staff, right? So, but it's a minefield. You're filling in a spreadsheet and a spreadsheet and a variation of the spreadsheet and then another proposal. We've got to simplify, and the way to simplify is to build a higher trust model. And there will be a way to build that model, but you have to start from the point of view of an intention from the Crown and from local government sometimes to trust, to be prepared to take a bit of a risk, because the prize, as my mate down the end there, I'm sure does whakapapa te Ngāti Porou actually, was saying, the prize is so important, which is improving the lives of a whānau and of their kids.
So there's a need for trust, and Wayne Knox earlier today spoke about the inherent racism in the system. Jamie, you mentioned in your kōrero that we do need to build partnerships with these government departments and the Crown. How do we do that? As someone who's clearly been on the other side of that table, how do you build those partnerships?
Well, I think first and foremost, in many of the discussions we've had around the Māori Housing Fund, the government need to acknowledge that they cannot deliver the outcomes to our whānau. So you've just got to be honest. The government just needs to accept that they're not going to be able to deliver to our whānau Māori. So that's the first step. So when you've acknowledged that, you can then sort of get to a point, okay, so we need to provide a solution to ensure that those of our whānau Māori are being supported. And I think that's where we've started to get to on the journey we've been in terms of the prototypes that we have that the Minister spoke about earlier. It started with that very fact. The challenge is, how do we continue that and how do we scale that up? Because the reality is, although $750 million in our mind is a large sum of capital, it is a drop in the ocean, given the task at hand. So I think for me it's acknowledging the government can't deliver for us. 2, that we are very well placed to deliver to our whānau, that they should have confidence in us delivering. And because quite simply it comes back to some of these basic values we have. We care. We actually do care about our families. Because certainly from our perspective, we want communities living in our rohe. In order for communities, for our whānau to live in our rohe, we need housing. We need people. We need employment. We look at things holistically. But I think, there remains some of the negative attitudes towards the ability for iwi and Māori to deliver for iwi and Māori. And Wayne called it out this morning. And it requires courageous leadership, not helped by a 3-year election cycle.
The issue of homelessness is a big crisis up and down the country. That issue is also prevalent here in Rotorua. How do we ensure that they're not forgotten when we talk about things like affordability?
It's a big question.
Big issues,
Probably multiple answers to it, but I mean, putting it in motels obviously isn't the right solution in my opinion. But it goes wider than that. It's for housing for anyone, no matter whether you're from your homeless to I don't know how many whānau out there living with mum and dad and in a spare room or in a garage or whatever, and that's probably the secret homelessness, and who knows what that figure is. But it all stems back to the affordability question, and that stems back to lack of supply and all those things. I mean, for us, in our market subdivision up there, we were about trying to encourage home ownership through our first home buyer programs, and the question of affordability there, we've had to take a hit on the land to make those houses affordable. So I mean, that's our commitment to, and we're happy to back that up by saying, well, every Ngāti Whakaue family that goes from a renter to a homeowner, that's a good investment. But I don't know if that's sustainable, you know, but lots of other things have to happen around that and be addressed, you know, from, you know, attitudes towards saving and all that support that needs to happen. So I think it's a big, long answer, about as long as the answer I've just given you.
No, he pai he rawe. Because you mentioned in that answer, you know, that there are some who may be homeless who are living with mum and dad at the moment. But that was always a sort of natural thing for us as hapu and as Māori communities in the time of our tupuna, was that we all lived together. Do we need to perhaps, you know, move back to some of that intergenerational living in order to, you know, set ourselves up in financial positions to be able to then branch out?
Yeah, I mean, maybe where it's possible to, but I know whānau there, you know, there's 3 or 4 siblings all in a 3-bedroom, you know, so sometimes, I mean, it's not practical too, but I know what you're saying, but yeah, it depends on the...
Can I think it's the difference between choice versus being forced to do it.
Yeah.
When you're forcing families to crowd together because there is no other option, that's not acceptable. When I go and stay with my grandmother, that's different because that's our choice to do that. I think the problem with the housing situation is our people don't have choices, and what we want to do with the solutions is provide choices.
And what sort of choices do you think would really work, Jamie?
Well, I think we don't need to own a home. Why do we need to own a home? It's a very Western sort of mindset, right? Because what matters is actually security. And when you think about security, I mean, our tupuna was about security. You know, tomorrow we're signing an agreement to have our Mounga Taranaki returned, not to us, but to be recognised as having their own legal personality. And where we sit as iwi and uri of our maunga, you know, it's required us to rethink our relationship. We've almost got to decolonise our minds because the solutions we need require us to think differently and actually go back to the wisdom we talk about often on the marae to guide the decisions we make around how we might live together. But my caution is we're talking about establishing a papakainga at our homestead. The challenge there is, you know, it's one thing to come together at Christmas for 2 weeks, but living together again, you know. But what that requires us is to work on our relationship, because that's part of it. We've become very individual, as individual whānau, as individuals, and so it does require us to actually return to those values we talk about. Everyone puts them up. I saw multiple, you know, manaakitanga, aroha, all of these things, but do we actually put it into practice? And do those values truly guide the decisions we make around the models we need to adopt to solve the challenges we face?
Now, we only have a few minutes left as part of this panel, so I'm wanting to head out now to the audience for anyone who may have a question. We do have our microphones that I showed you guys earlier before, just over here, so if you have a pātai that you'd like to contribute, please, Ane, etahi, put your hand up.
Tātou. Taku waiwai ko Ngāti Pikiao. Taku hene ngaro ko Ngāti Whakaue. Taku manawa, the worst pressed tribe in Te Arawa, Waitaha. No reira tō huingoa ko maru colonising capsule. Anyway, I've listened to all the kōrero at this hui, and I summed it up in one. And I want to remind you what Te Rangihau had said. What we're talking about is whanaungatanga, the network and support system by way, for want of a better definition for kith and kinship, whakapapa. The links and supports by way of whakapapa. That's the first point. But I also like to remind you that I was impressed with Jamie Tuuta's presentation and Shumabeel's presentation. And I want to say that what we're talking about is self-determination is grow your own. And there was a touch on growing your own bank. Now we could overcome the banks by collaborating together, putting all our equities on a piece of paper and saying, we're going to deal with you, ANZ, and I'm sorry, Westpac, you won't be dealing with us. In that way, you're growing your own economy. Priority is the social, environmental economy is what we're looking at first. If you develop that, your economic economy will follow. So your social economy first, and your economic economy will follow.
Tēnā koe koro. So I think the question was, is there room for greater collaboration, consolidation, when we are approaching the different banks? Shumabeel.
Koera te mate nui o te ao Māori, ne? Ka kōrero tātou mo tēnei mea te kotahitanga, tēnei mea te mahitahi. Hoi anō mo te wakatangata I tēnei kaupapa, he ua. But I guess, Koro, you're right. Because in order to collaborate and work collectively, you first and foremost need to be strong and secure in your own identity and who you are in order for you to relate and work with others. Nō reire, tautoko ana he rā kōrero, but it requires leadership. I mean, we're seeking to do that through our kauriora model. And some will work with us, some may not. Kei te pai tērā. Kei tērā tōnā ke tikanga.
Wā I rongo au I te mahitahi a ngai tahu me koutou ne, I tuku I wā rātou rauemi ki a koutou. That was a sign of partnership in your kōrero when you mentioned that you'd approach ngai tahu in terms of the mahi that they'd already done to sort of, you know, as a model of collaboration. Do we have another pātai from the audience? We're about to wrap up, e te whānau.
Kia ora koutou, and thank you. I'm interested in affordability and the climate crisis. We've heard the heart-wrenching stories from Cyclone Gabriel and seen calls for buyout, managed retreat buyout. Jonathan Boston has talked about compensation in the National Adaptation Act. I wonder whether it's time that we consider housing not as investment but as necessary shelter in a time of climate crisis, and is it time that we look at solutions like universal basic services, or what other tools do you think our political leaders might need if we are to meet both affordability and the climate crisis head on?
Tēnā koe mo tērā pātai.
I can kick off. So our planning rules and system, I think with the RMA reform and the spatial planning requirements will improve somewhat location and risk associated with particular activities within areas. So I think there's a piece of that, and I think we've all heard about the Auckland example, where council gave in knowing that houses were being built in hazard areas. A big piece comes back to the type of housing from a build standpoint that is resilient but is cost effective, because I think that's the big challenge. 2 years ago I thought I would be able to crack it and build houses at $1,000 a square metre. It was actually possible back then, but there was no incentive for people to go down that path. But I think that's the first comment. I think the planning rules and the decision making. You must have a...
I've got heaps of stuff. We could have hours of conversation about this stuff. Adaptation is a huge topic. I don't like Jonathan's model of compensation because it will never happen.
Yeah.
It's too expensive. Land swaps is where the game is. We've got to do land swaps. We can't continue to put our most poor and vulnerable in the most exposed places. Yeah. It does not make sense. We've got to do land swaps. We've got to invest in infrastructure like the nation building that we did after the Second World War. There is no alternative to spending money. You cannot build your nation without spending money. We have to have the courage and the boldness to go with what we did in the past was wrong, and we have to do things differently. There is no other option.
Kia ora. I think there was also a comment about housing as shelter.
It's my answer for everything.
We have marae too. Our marae's kicked into gear during the cyclone response efforts, and I think that value should be better recognised by central and local governments, the role that marae play as shelter in times of crisis. And also in terms of housing, not as investment. While it's investment in communities and some of our most vulnerable communities is something that I've just picked up today, just to cover off those 2 points. I think we have another pātai, perhaps our last pātai, down the back.
Kia ora, ko ngā tika hununu mena ruahine rangi ko Dr. Grace Walker-Aho. I'm a data scientist that works with Te Matapihi, so I actually engage with survey design data in order to understand how our data represents us, and in order for us to advocate for new needs and the way in which we want to develop our own papakainga or our own investment strategies. Feel free to do all of our surveys. Just a little promo for me. But anyway, when a lot of the stuff that we have been doing is affordability is only one component. When we're thinking about these types of developments and areas, it's often just only a house, and I've found this when working with different runanga and rōpū, they don't often think of the other forms of infrastructure that goes around this. So if you can provide an affordable home, how are you guys providing solutions to affordable healthcare, affordable schooling, affordable transport, and ways in which we can still access employment with infrastructure, so that way we're not paying more to get into our jobs in order to access healthcare? That's a fun question. It's what I do for my mahi, so I'd love to see your solutions, or at least your pātai. Kia ora.
I'll start off and then these fellas can jump in. So I've been sitting here and your question triggered this again. What we're talking about here is, to a large part, is around the impacts of poverty and the reality that for various reasons as a nation we've come to a point where we seem to accept poverty, or we're, at the very least, we're frozen, we're immobile, we're not sure how to respond to it. And that ends up impacting some of the areas that your pātai picks up, which is around the ability not just to maybe you get a home, or you get a rental home, whatever it might be, and you can afford that, but you can't get access, or you cannot afford the access into all these other services. So my only reflection really is what you know, because it's embedded in your question, that you have to deal with all those aspects. I mean, in our case, we're like a number of the people here. I mean, look, emergency housing, transitional housing, social housing, all these tags. Wayne was right. We're just churning people around in these spaces and robbing them of their dignity, and they just can't get out of it. You know, we've got to put the sword through that. Part of that is the social housing piece. It's not the only piece, so that no one should be living in a motel. If you can get them at the very least into a social home that's connected, in our case, all our efforts are going into working with our local runanga and our local NGOs to link people up once we've actually got a roof over their head that doesn't leak and no mould in the place and is a healthy home. You do that, then you start connecting. That, I think, is the only way we can sort of operate at a local level. But the fact that as a nation we accept poverty and that we think it's okay, and weirdly there are too many people with their hands on the levers who are promoting this view that if you're poor, it's your bloody fault. And we've got to put a sword through that taniwha pretty quick.
Just some of the work we've been looking at, and this again a couple of years ago, the telco space. So we've been developing a model where we would create a Māori owned and controlled MVNO. Skinny? Anyone on Skinny in the room? It's mostly the kids, yeah, so we're a bit older in this audience. But actually starting to take control, so having our own Māori MVNO and setting that up and reinvesting the profits back into delivering sort of services to our whānau. We've been looking at the benefit of having our own smart meters and utilising data in terms of understanding power use with our families, with a view to locking in power arrangements. and then through to insurance and all of those sorts of things. A lot of the stuff, I think, centres back to Koro's question here around how willing and courageous are we to come together to act and work collectively to utilise the scale that we've always had to deliver efficiencies and broader benefits back to our whānau. And I guess for me, that's probably what I would want everyone to think about. Not think about what you might do individually, but how you might work in a broader collective to deliver benefits. Because we've never harnessed the purchasing power of Māori. And if we did, look out.
Tēnā koutou. A tēnā koutou I roto I te iwi e mātakitaki mai nei mō ngā pātai. I'd like to thank our panellists. We have come to the end of this wāhanga and we've got our final speaker up next. Shumabeel, Eaqub, Jamie Tuuta, James Te Puni and Ray Morrison. Tēnā rā koutou katoa. I'll ask you to exit the stage and then I will introduce our next speaker.